Welcome to the MultiCultural Mindset broadcast. Your host is Dr. Laverne Haynes Collins, a licensed professional counselor, award-winning trainer, and keynote speaker. Dr. Collins is the author of Overlooked, Counselor Insights for the Unspoken Issues in Black American Life. Dr. Collins has also been a featured monthly columnist in the American Counseling Association's Counseling Today magazine with her Honoring Diversity column. Now, here's Dr. Collins.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of the MultiCultural Mindset, where we explore the topics of race, faith, culture, and trauma as related to the mental health of Black Americans. I'm your host, Dr. Laverne Haynes Collins, and I'm glad you decided to join in for today's podcast. Every Friday, a new episode launches with topics that help counselors grow out of the mindsets that don't serve our racially identified practice communities well. That's right. I want you to outgrow anything that you've been taught that blames Black communities for problems that are actually caused by racism. I want you to outgrow anything that suggests ways to fix Black people instead of fixing any failing but yet prevailing ideologies that we were taught in graduate school. And I want you to outgrow anything that you've been taught that points to biased mental health deficits in Black people, Black life, or Black culture. Instead, I want you to grow into a multicultural mindset that makes your counseling a good fit for more members of Black communities. We are addressing and we are challenging widely held beliefs about who Black people are and what Black people need. And that means intentionally seeing what others overlook. The historical factors, the identity issues, the clinical biases, the losses, and the strengths that are generally overlooked. And those are the 5 areas that I talk about in my book, and areas that I'll be talking about in upcoming podcast episodes too. And by the way, if you have not purchased your book yet, the title is Overlooked, Counselor Insights for the Unspoken Issues in Black American Life. It's available on Amazon.com, at Rowman and Littlefield Publishing, and anywhere that books are sold online. So, a lot has transpired in the past 2 weeks with the presidential election now behind us, and many African Americans are feeling very sad, discouraged, angry, disappointed. There's just a broad range of painful emotion. And, in the cycle of human development, loss is an inevitable fact of life. And this is not just about winning or losing the votes. This is not what this is about. I want to talk to you today about the hidden sorrow of racism. I want to talk about grief and loss on a larger scale, but I also want to bring it back home to what many people are feeling right now. Again, loss is inevitable. Losses begin at an early age, sometimes in small ways, sometimes in big ways. A child loses a tooth or a favorite toy or a family pet, or a family moves to a new home and that child loses their neighborhood best friend. It could be that a grandparent passes away and the child feels the loss, but we find ways to ease the pain of a young child's loss. We find ways to comfort that child and maybe even provide some attempt to replace what's lost, like getting a new pet or setting up play dates with children in the new community. Or we assure them that whoever has passed away is maybe watching over them. But some types of loss get overlooked. Some types of loss are known only by the people whose daily experience includes racism and racialization. Society doesn't give space for grieving the losses or the pain of discrimination, the loss of safety, medical racism, mass incarceration, and shorter lifespans. Those are simply not losses that the general population considers. Listen, how do you grieve the moment of dignity loss that racism brings? How does one mourn the health effects of medical racism? How do you process the loss of opportunities? How do you grieve that loss of opportunity that society never granted? How does one grieve the effects of being treated like a threat because of their race? How does one grieve over the shorter life expectancies that are brought about by health disparities? How does one grieve the freedom lost by the burden of suspicion that is on your race? How does one grieve the losses that are born out of things like ethnic bias or criminalization or stereotypes and microaggressions, separation of families, devalued traditions? Well, for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, these are examples of ambiguous losses. And what I mean by ambiguous losses is that each loss is questioned. Like, has there really been a loss? And each of these losses cuts to the core of our human spirit. And each of these losses really allows no room for heartache. There's no bereavement time from work. There's no one sending gift cards. And I'm not saying that's what we should do in response to these kinds of losses. But my point is that when you have a loss, say a death loss, people gather around. They send those gift cards, they donate meals, they send flowers. But when we talk about these losses, there are no rituals for mourning. There are no apologies for the loss. There's no societal acknowledgement that something has been taken when there's a dignity loss, when there's a freedom loss, when you're grieving the effects of being treated like a threat. There's no societal acknowledgement, and the very reality of a loss can be challenged. Did a loss really occur? Well, the answer is yes. And the result of these kinds of losses is disenfranchised grief. Disenfranchised grief. Now, this term was coined by a European American named Kenneth Doka. And Dr. Kenneth Doka coined that term, came up with that term to describe grief that is not publicly acknowledged by society. Grief that cannot be mourned publicly is disenfranchised grief. Why is it called that? You have to understand the origin of the word, I think. And forgive me for those who are my French speaking friends, probably going to mess up this word, but this is an old French word. That's the root word here. Enfranchir. Enfranchir means to make free. To make free. So disenfranchised, in other words, like disenfranchir, means made unfree, not free. And when we study grief and bereavement, enfranchisement applies to people who have encountered loss and have the right to experience and express feelings concerning their loss. And they can also expect society to acknowledge and offer them support. They have the freedom to publicly represent themselves as people who have suffered a loss. They may grieve publicly, they can mourn with other people, they can receive support from others. But when a person's grief and bereavement are disenfranchised, they are denied the legitimacy and the freedom of expression for their grief. Their inner anguish stays concealed from public view because society does not acknowledge their need or their right or their privilege to grieve openly. Now, generally speaking, counselors associate disenfranchised grief with losses such as the death of an abuser or infertility, or maybe the end of an illicit relationship, or perhaps even separation from an incarcerated loved one. But counselors are not typically trained to consider disenfranchised grief related to racism and discrimination. And that's in part because Dr. Doka did not come up with this disenfranchised grief term to describe what happens racially. He came up with this term to describe what happens when there is a death whereby the bereaved person had a past or former or awkward relationship with the deceased. What we can do, however, is apply this term to the reality that racism brings hidden sorrow and grief that cannot be publicly grieved or mourned because society has no respect for that kind of grief. But all grief warrants empathy, warrants compassion, is worthy of social support. And unfortunately, disenfranchised grief is attached to a loss that society just does not validate. And as a result, for the person who is experiencing this grief, their healing process can be prolonged, it can be made more difficult, and it can even be permanently almost elusive, like healing never really happening. These losses are commonly ongoing and continuous. In other words, there's like no end. So, Black African American members of our practice community may need to address this disenfranchised grief in a safe place. And to add one more thing to your consideration of disenfranchised grief, it might also result from internalized racism, that self-defeating form of racism that causes a person to be biased against themselves or against their own ethno-racial group because they have bought into the messages from oppressive systems. So I hate my hair, or we're never on time, or you know how we are. Statements that would sound like there's self-hatred or group hatred or disrespect for oneself, a lack of appreciation for oneself or one's group. That internalized racism can also be a form of disenfranchised grief, where we are not appreciating something about ourselves or our people, and one day realize that we have lost time in that place of group hatred or self-hatred. We might need to grieve and process losses that come from feeling less valuable than members of other groups. If any point in time a person has despised or undervalued their own physical characteristics that are part of their heritage, their identity, they might need to grieve that loss of self-respect. They may also need to recover from shame-based thinking and damaged self esteem. So sometimes disenfranchised grief comes from directly from situations that a person experiences in the world. Sometimes disenfranchised grief is silently held because of internalized dislike or disrespect. Now, clinically, what do we do with all of this? Disenfranchised grief is not a diagnosis. It's not in a symptom description, but it can account for the symptoms that you may see that are associated with something like major depression or prolonged grief disorder. It might be associated with disorders of extreme stress that aren't specified otherwise, or perhaps adjustment disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder or a persistent complex bereavement disorder. That's what we used to call complicated grief disorder. And I believe that rather than placing depression at the center of the treatment plan, counselors should focus on the source of grief and see if that uh, member of your practice community is interested in working through any disenfranchised grief that might be there. And might they be interested in processing the loss from that perspective? Now, this recognizes this unique problem that's created by disenfranchised grief because, you see, unlike other grief, the experience of disenfranchised race based grief is typically not recognized by those who are living with it. Why? Because they have learned to live with it. But like other grief, there are similarities. See, like other grief, it is characterized by feelings of anger and anxiety and depression. And what is common is those symptoms become the diagnosis of record because the disenfranchised grief of racism gets overlooked. And again, disenfranchised grief is not a diagnosis. You cannot bill for it, but we don't deal with the root when we're only dealing with the anger and the anxiety and the depression and not recognizing the hidden sorrow of racism and the disenfranchised grief. Again, the grief that becomes disenfranchised because there's no place to share that in community as you mourn. I believe that if a person is suffering from unrecognized, disenfranchised grief, if the counselor is not aware and cannot recognize the presence of that counselor will miss the mark in their clinical interventions because those interventions will be aimed at the wrong target. You'll aim your intervention at generalized anxiety disorder without addressing the underlying disenfranchised grief. And an even greater disservice is done toward the client because the counselor now is contributing to the disenfranchisement because they avoid discussing the grief of racism, further disenfranchising the pain of that person's loss. So, what do we do? What do we do? Disenfranchised grief leaves a person feeling unnoticed with their pain, which can intensify their anger and their feelings of invalidation. There's also a judgmental piece of this, judgmental element when it comes to race. Disenfranchised grief has this sense of invalidation because it's related to a society that's chosen to make the values of racialized people insignificant. Society chooses to ignore and minimize what Black and African American people grieve as a result of racism. And this is when you hear, oh, what are you worried about? Or why are you still bringing that up? Oh, that was nothing. What do you mean a loss? Well, that wasn't your loss. Well, that was a long time ago. Haven't you gotten over that? Etc. And so forth and so on, and so forth and so on. It's important to provide an appropriate level of psychoeducation when you see a person with disenfranchised grief and the hidden sorrow of racism, even if we're talking about current events, especially perhaps if we're talking about current events. The psychoeducation is what helps a person understand what they're feeling, helps them understand why they're unable maybe to control some of their emotions, why their emotions seem so dysregulated, because this disenfranchised grief has been compounded within them, and there is no place to mourn and grieve and let it out. People need to be seen and heard and known and cared about. They need a way and an opportunity to process their grief and attend to their emotions as they name and grieve racism's effects. As providers of counseling and mental health services, we have to be aware. We have to recognize the disenfranchised grief of racism. We have to be sensitive to the many ripple effects of bias and discrimination and racism within the life of one of our practice community members. And this requires that we listen to each person's whole, full story. It's very easy to listen only to the presenting symptoms of our Black practice community. We listen to depression symptoms and relational problems. We listen to concerns about financial constraints and health challenges, but those do not stand alone. The stories, including the grief of racialized groups, have always been silenced. And counselors and mental health providers are in a position to hear those stories and to respond with cultural humility, with empathy, with advocacy, and with a multicultural mindset. That's what we want to do. Disenfranchised grief, the hidden sorrow of racism. Let's grow into an understanding of that. Let's grow into being strong with our interventions. Let's grow into a responsiveness. Let's grow into the ability to invite that from the background to the foreground of the client-counselor relationship. That's all we have for today. But I thank you for tuning into today's episode on understanding disenfranchised grief and loss and how to incorporate that into your multicultural mindset. If you work as a mental health professional, I hope this episode encourages you to look deeper into your practice, to challenge old assumptions, and to develop a truly inclusive approach to therapy. If you're not a counselor, I hope that you will also look deeper into life and explore where you may have been holding disenfranchised grief and the hidden sorrow of racism. Remember that creating a safe space means validating one's whole self, including their cultural and their racial identities. As always, if you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe, to leave a review, a comment, and like. Share it with others also who might benefit from this. But please do subscribe to my channel. And remember, we have the power to change our mental health systems as each of us develops and incorporates a multicultural mindset. This is Laverne Haynes Collins signing off. And until next time, keep practicing with empathy, humility, and a multicultural mindset. Hello, I'm Dr. Laverne Collins, and I want to invite you to be a part of something that is going to transform your practice. Here's the deal. For years, counselors have asked me if I provide consultation services on topics related to mental health and racial disparities and effectiveness in multicultural counseling. I've been providing trainings on these topics for the last 20 years, and I always get that request for consultation services. Well, I'm now offering a monthly consultation group on the topics that you bring to me. That's right. Every month, you can bring your racial diversity and counselor sensitivity questions to me, and I will share my insights. And this is available at a phenomenal group rate. Now, here's why you need this. We are living in a time where it is imperative that our helping presence is culturally responsive and culturally responsible in service to our practice communities. However, many counselors did not get very much education on really working effectively with Black, Indigenous, and people of color in graduate school. And many people have struggled to keep up with the current findings and the best practices for serving racially identified populations. So I've developed this monthly counseling group that meets on the first Friday of every month from 8:30 a.m. to 10 a.m. Eastern Time. And it's simply called Office Hours with Dr. Collins. And when you join this, I'm going to work with you in this consultation group to answer the questions that just come up in day-to-day practice, questions that come up for you and other providers, questions that you bring me about issues of race, faith, culture, and trauma. Now, this is a safe space where you can bring all the questions other folks don't talk about. You know what I'm talking about, the unaskable questions. For me, there is really no such thing as an unaskable question. And if you've participated in any of my webinars before, you know I go into great detail and deep content. So again, you can bring your own questions and learn from other people's questions. Your questions, my insight, and my 30 years of expertise on these topics. You'll have a full 90 minutes of my time every month for such a low price that you really cannot pass it up. So continue reading on this page. Get in on this now, too, because slots are limited and they'll go fast. And I'll see you during my office hours. Bye for now.